What if love doesn't come crashing in, but arrives quietly, over tea, over time, over the choices we make when no one's watching? If you believe the softest stories can leave the deepest mark, go ahead and tap like. And if you'd like more moments like this, stories of second chances, slow mornings, and the kind of love that lingers, hit subscribe. Now, let me tell you a story. The day I married Alexander Cole, New York was wrapped in fog so thick it made the world feel like a painting half finished. The sky was colorless, the kind of soft, dull gray that swallows sound and thought alike. I remember thinking how fitting it was that on the day my life would change, the city itself chose silence. The church was old, older than most buildings on the Upper East Side, tucked away behind wrought iron gates and sleeping ivy. Inside, the chandeliers were lit, but their glow couldn't quite warm the marble floors or high vaulted ceilings. Everything echoed, the hush of footsteps, the rustle of silk. Even my heartbeat felt like it carried too far. I was 24. My dress had belonged to my mother. I'd spent weeks altering it by hand in our apartment downtown, threading tiny pearls back into place, pressing the lace under an old iron. She'd worn it when she married my father in a garden filled with birdsong. I wore it under a ceiling, too high for comfort, beside a man who hadn't looked me in the eye. Alexander Cole was already waiting at the altar. Tall. Still. His jaw sharp like glass, his dark suit tailored to perfection. He didn't smile. He didn't glance toward the pews, most of which were empty. He simply stood, hands folded, waiting for the transaction to complete. It wasn't his fault, not entirely. This wasn't a wedding born from love. It was an agreement. A solution to a problem with too many zeros. My father's debt, my family's crumbling dignity, all of it tucked neatly into a contract and signed in silence. I don't remember much of the ceremony, only that there were no flowers, no music, and no priest. Just a city judge reading lines from a paper, asking questions we both answered with nods instead of vows. "Do you take this woman?" "Yes." His voice was steady, indifferent. That was it. Afterward, there was no celebration. The car that took us to his townhouse barely stirred the fog. I sat quietly in the back seat, glancing at the gold band on my finger, wondering what my mother would say if she were well enough to speak. The house was grand, of course. Polished wood, tall ceilings, clean lines. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and something deeper. Leather, maybe, or time itself. The butler showed me to a guest room with neutral walls and heavy drapes, and said nothing else. Later, when the house fell quiet and I could no longer hear footsteps down the hall, I sat at the vanity and looked at myself. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. The lace sleeves were too delicate for someone so unsure. The pearls in my ears, borrowed, not mine, reflected the dim lighting, but gave off no warmth. I looked like someone playing dress-up in someone else's life, a placeholder in a story that wasn't mine. And then, as I opened the top drawer of the vanity, I found it. A folded letter, tucked beneath a handkerchief I hadn't brought. The paper was soft from time, the edges slightly worn. My heart paused. I knew that handwriting. It was my mother's. I unfolded it with care, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The ink was faded, but her script, graceful and looping, was unmistakable. Sweet Vi, I know this day is not what you dreamed. I know the silence hurts more than any words could. Marriage is not always love at first sight. Sometimes it is duty. Sometimes it is survival. But if you stay kind, if you stay open, it may grow into something deeper. Love may not come first, but it can come last and stay. Mom. Beneath the letter, scribbled in a darker ink as if added later, was one last line. Marriage doesn't have to begin with love, but it must end with choice. I sat there for a long time, letter pressed to my chest, listening to the house breathe, if it even could. Somewhere far away, I thought I heard a door shut, Maybe Alexander turning in for the night. Or maybe just the house settling into its silence. My fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from something more tender. Grief, perhaps. Or hope. Struggling to rise. I hadn't chosen this path. But maybe I could choose how to walk it. Maybe the story wasn't over yet. I folded the letter again, carefully. Placed it back where I found it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But I also didn't sleep. That night, in a room too grand to be mine, wrapped in sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and cold linen, I made my first true decision since the wedding. I would not harden. I would not become small. I would remain soft in a world that had tried to make me silent. I would leave space for something gentle to grow. Maybe, if I did, this house, this life, could one day feel like home. And maybe, just maybe, the man with the glass-cut jaw and guarded eyes might not always be a stranger. The second morning of our marriage, I woke before the sun. The townhouse was still cloaked in gray light, the kind that makes even the chandeliers seem shy. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, padded barefoot down the wide, echoing hallway, and found myself in the kitchen. Not because I was hungry, but because it felt like the only room in the house that hadn't forgotten how to be human. The kitchen was old, probably original to the house, judging by the worn tile and heavy oak cabinets. The walls smelled faintly of flour and something else. Lemon, maybe. Or memory. I put the kettle on. It was muscle memory, really. Back home, I used to brew tea for my mother each morning, just before her first coughing spell began. She liked it strong with a slice of ginger, no sugar. Let it bite back a little, she'd joke, tapping the rim of her cup. Just like life. As the kettle warmed, I found a small china teapot tucked into the corner of a cabinet. Cream-colored with a faint crack along the handle. Well-loved, like something that had survived more than one kind of storm. I made 2 cups that morning, one for myself, and one I placed quietly on the marble counter in the corner, near the doorway, that led toward Alexander's wing of the house. I didn't expect him to drink it, but somehow, it felt like the right thing to do. Maybe I just needed to do something kind. Something that asked for nothing in return. The next morning, I did it again, and the morning after that. On the 4th day, I walked into the kitchen and froze. His cup, still faintly warm, sat on the counter, half empty. No one had touched the other dishes. The butler hadn't moved it. That much I knew, and it was still resting in the same spot I had left it. He'd drunk the tea. I stared at it for longer than I probably should have, then slowly poured myself another cup and sat down, alone but not entirely. There was something strangely intimate about that empty teacup. He hadn't said anything. No thank you. No acknowledgement. But the act of drinking it, choosing to drink it, spoke louder than 100 words from a man like him. Later that day, I passed him in the hall. He nodded. That was all. But it was different from the first time. His eyes lingered for a fraction, longer. Not warm, not soft, but not dismissive either. It was a pause, a crack. I returned the nod and kept walking. That evening I visited my mother. She was staying in a smaller guest room downstairs, where the windows caught the late afternoon light just right. I brought her soup and helped her with her hair. She was weaker than last week, but still smiled as I tucked the blanket tighter around her. "Heard you're married now," she teased, eyes sparkling with fatigue. "Have you made him tea yet?" "I have," I said. "He hasn't thrown it away." She laughed, a soft, worn sound. "Then you're doing better than most." I almost told her about the letter I'd found. Almost asked if she had meant for me to find it after the wedding. But I didn't. Not yet. There was something sacred about that letter. Something I wasn't ready to open in daylight. Instead, I sat beside her and we talked about nonsense. Flowers, old recipes, neighbors from years ago, but her voice faded midway through a story, and I could see the tiredness gathering behind her eyes. When I kissed her forehead, her skin felt cool, like river stone. I stayed in the kitchen after putting her to bed. I sat at the table where I'd left his tea that morning. The china cup had been washed and dried, placed neatly back in the cabinet. So he noticed. So he cared, enough to notice. The next morning, there were 2 cups again. That day, when I walked past Alexander's study, I paused. Just for a second, the door was slightly ajar. I could see the edge of a desk, some books stacked neatly, a single framed photo facing away, and there, beside the lamp, sat the teacup, half full, still warm, still there, and next to it, a note, folded, blank on the outside. I didn't touch it, of course not, but I stood there, heart held quiet in my chest, as if waiting for a breath that hadn't come yet. Then I walked away. Later that evening, just before I turned in, I passed the study again. The door was closed, but the teacup was gone. Something was changing. I couldn't name it yet, but it was real. A rhythm had begun to form. 2 lives in quiet orbit. Cups of tea as messages passed between strangers who didn't quite know how to speak. I wrote in my journal that night. Just 1 line. He drank the tea again. It was not love, but it was something. A kindness returned. A ritual repeated. And in a house filled with cold walls and formal silence, that small, half-empty cup felt like the first word of a story neither of us knew we were writing. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I first saw her. I had wandered into the library, not out of curiosity, really, but because the rest of the house felt too big, too empty, and I needed a place where books could hum gently in the silence. The room smelled like cedar and old pages, with sunlight sifting in through tall, dust-flecked windows. A small fire had been lit, more for decor than warmth, and everything in the room whispered, quiet, controlled, untouched. And then I saw the frame. It sat alone on a narrow side table, half hidden behind a stack of legal volumes. The photo was black and white, softly faded, and the girl in it, maybe 17, maybe younger, was smiling at someone just out of the shot. There was a lightness in her eyes, something unguarded, like she hadn't learned yet how to brace herself against the world. She didn't look like Alexander, but she belonged to him. I knew that without asking. Just as I reached for the frame, the housekeeper entered quietly with a stack of linens. She paused when she saw me. "That's Miss Sophie," she said softly. "Sophie?" "His sister." There was a pause. "She passed. Years ago." She didn't say how. I nodded, and the housekeeper left. But the room suddenly felt colder. That night, it rained. Not the polite drizzle of spring, but a storm that pressed itself against the windows, making the house groan and whisper. I had just finished helping my mother back into bed. She'd had a difficult evening, her breath short, her hands trembling more than usual, when my phone buzzed with a message I didn't expect. "Alexander, I'll be back in 20. Don't wait up." I stared at it for a long time. It was the first time he'd texted me since the wedding. I wasn't sure what it meant, if it meant anything at all, but I replied, "Thank you," and left it at that. But when the clock struck 11:30 and the rain grew louder, something in me stirred. I crept down the staircase, half hoping to catch a glimpse of him, to see where he went when he wasn't tucked away behind closed doors. I reached the foyer just as I heard the front lock click open. He stepped inside, rain trailing from his coat, hair damp, eyes sharp, but tired. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. His gaze flicked to the towel in my hand. I hadn't even realized I was holding it. Wordlessly, I stepped forward and handed it to him. He took it. Slowly. Gently. "Thank you," he said. His voice was quieter in the dark, rougher somehow. More human, Are you all right? I asked before I could stop myself. He looked at me for a long moment. Not through me. At me. I had to take someone to the hospital, he said. My breath caught. My mother? I asked quickly. He shook his head. No. Someone else. A pause. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, My sister used to live in the city, not far from here. I felt the air shift. She died, didn't she? He nodded. I waited. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the storm against the windows. I was supposed to pick her up that night. He said finally. I canceled last minute. A board vote ran late. She walked home. It was raining. The words hung there between us. I didn't reach for him. I didn't say anything. But I didn't look away. That photo in the library, I said softly. He nodded. Again, she used to bring me tea every morning, even when I was too busy to drink it. Something in my chest twisted. I think she would have liked you. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw something new. Not pain, not guilt, gratitude. I didn't expect you to stay, he said quietly. Neither did I replied. And then I said the first honest thing I had in weeks. But I think I'm supposed to be here. We didn't touch. We didn't embrace. But when he walked past me, heading down the hall toward his room, he paused. I'll make tea tomorrow, he said. And then softer. For you. The invitation came quietly. My mother had been watching, the fog roll across the windows for nearly an hour when she turned to me and said, Ask him to join us for tea. I blinked. Who? Your husband, she replied, with a knowing smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. It was the gentlest of suggestions, but in her voice, there was the weight of intention. I hesitated. Alexander and I had shared tea, yes, but only through gestures. Cups left, cups taken. We hadn't yet sat across from each other, steam curling between us. Words spoken aloud instead of sipped in silence. I don't know if he'll say yes, I said honestly. Then ask anyway, she said, reaching for my hand. Tea isn't always about thirst. So that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the townhouse grew still, I stood outside Alexander's study. My hand hovered near the doorframe, heart tapping like a spoon on porcelain. He looked up when I knocked, surprised, but not cold. My mother. She wants to have tea. In the kitchen, I said. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, with a quiet nod, he stood. I don't know what I expected. Formality, discomfort, maybe even refusal. But instead, he followed me down the stairs, the silence between us softer than it had ever been. The kitchen had already been prepared. I'd lit a candle and arranged the tea set on the old oak table. Nothing elaborate, just 3 mismatched cups, a pot of chamomile and honey, and a small plate of almond biscuits my mother used to bake on Sundays when I was little. She was already seated, bundled in a shawl, eyes bright with more mischief than illness. Well, Mr. Cole, she said warmly as he entered. It's about time you came to the kitchen. I was beginning to think you were allergic to wooden chairs. Alexander smiled, barely, but truly. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. I took the third seat, between them, pouring the tea with hands that only shook a little. We drank in near silence for the first few minutes. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of quiet that settles between people who are still learning the shape of each other's presence. Then, my mother began to speak. She told a story about me as a child, how I once tried to sew a dress for my doll and ended up stitching the hem to the living room curtain. She laughed as she told it, voice worn but alive, and I felt the warmth spread through the room like a second candle. Alexander listened. Really listened. Not with polite nods, but with stillness. The kind that says, I'm here. I'm hearing you. When my mother paused, he leaned forward slightly. Did she cry when the curtain came down? My mother chuckled. She did, but only because she thought she'd ruined something important, not because she failed. I met his eyes for a brief second. There was something in his gaze I hadn't seen before. Not admiration, not pity. Something closer to understanding. He stayed longer than I thought he would. When the tea ran low, I moved to refill the pot, but he stood first. I've got it, he said. He took the kettle from the stove, unfamiliar maybe, but not unwilling, and poured gently, carefully, as if handling something fragile. The steam caught the light, curling between us, and in that moment, the kitchen didn't feel like a borrowed space anymore. It felt like home. Later, after we helped my mother back to bed, I lingered near the sink, rinsing the teacups beneath warm water. Alexander stood beside me, drying the cups with a linen cloth. For a while, we didn't speak. Then he said, "She's strong." "She is," I whispered. "She reminds me of Sophie." I turned, surprised. "She used to tell stories like that," he continued. "The kind that weren't really about the story at all. Just about being seen." The silence returned, but not for long. As I placed the last cup on the rack, a soft sound floated through the hallway. Music. Not from a speaker. A piano. I stepped into the corridor, heart tugged forward. The sound led me toward the parlor at the end of the hall where the old baby Gran sat, rarely touched. He was there. Alexander, his back to me, hands on the keys. The melody was simple, slow, familiar. An old ballad my mother used to hum while folding laundry. He didn't play perfectly, but every note was placed with care, like footsteps on soft ground. I didn't go in. I simply stood at the doorway, one hand pressed to the frame, listening. And something in me shifted. He hadn't told me he played. Hadn't told me he remembered the song from my mother's stories. He just sat there, letting the music fill the space between us. He was no longer the stranger from the altar. He was a man with memories, with regret, with hands that could hold sorrow and still offer something beautiful. That night, as I returned to my room, I passed the vanity where I had first found my mother's letter. I pulled it out again and read the final line. Marriage doesn't have to begin with love, but it must end with choice. For the first time, I thought I might choose him, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The news came in the form of an envelope, cream-colored, heavy, no return address. It arrived at the townhouse early in the morning, slipped beneath the front door like a shadow. I found it resting on the console table in the foyer when I came downstairs to check on the day's mail. I recognized the seal immediately. It belonged to one of my father's old business partners, a man whose handshake was colder than winter steel, whose eyes never quite looked straight. Years ago, he had funded one of my father's projects. It had failed. Quietly, privately, or so we thought. Inside the envelope was a single page, a threat, carefully wrapped in civility. If Alexander didn't pull out of a certain real estate deal within 48 hours, the man would go public with everything. My father's mismanagement, the questionable loans, the personal favors repaid with interest neither financial nor kind. I stood there, letter trembling in my hands, heart thrashing. I didn't want Alexander to see it, but he already had. I turned and found him at the base of the stairs, dressed in his usual charcoal suit, a subtle crease in his brow. "Put it down," he said, voice steady. "Alexander." I read it. There was no panic in his tone, no anger, just quiet resolve, like someone who had already come to a decision. "I can fix this," I said, my voice low and desperate. "He doesn't have to know we're married. I can go to him, ask him to wait." "No." That one word stopped me, cold. "This isn't yours to fix," he said. "I'm the reason it's happening," I whispered. He stepped closer. Not imposing, not stern, just steady, grounded. "You're not your father's mistakes." I looked up at him. His eyes, dark, unreadable just days ago, now held something I recognized. Protectiveness. Maybe even belief. "You'll lose money," I said. "Millions." He didn't flinch. "You'll lose face." He shrugged slightly. "I've lost. Worse." I was quiet a moment, trying to understand what kind of man would do this. Not for love, not even for obligation, but simply because he could. Because he chose to. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you do this for us?" Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "Because your mother looks at me like I'm worth saving." He paused. "And because you bring me tea every morning and never ask for anything in return." My breath caught. Of all the reasons I'd imagined, those were the ones I never expected. That afternoon, he called a press conference. He announced his withdrawal from the deal, citing internal restructuring and a shift in philanthropic focus. The market rippled, confused but respectful. The man with the envelope said nothing. He knew better. Some powers don't respond to threats. They bury them. I watched from the back of the room, heart tight in my chest, as Alexander fielded questions with calm precision. He never once mentioned my father. Never once implied that this decision had anything to do with anything other than choice. A quiet kind of sacrifice. After the conference, we returned to the townhouse in silence. Not cold, just full. Like there were too many words between us to say out loud all at once. I went to the kitchen, brewed tea. He joined me a few minutes later. No tie, sleeves rolled up, tension still clinging to the lines of his shoulders. I placed the cup in front of him. He didn't speak right away. Just held the warm china in both hands, as if grounding himself. Then, softly, "Do you believe in second chances?" I blinked. "Second chances at what?" "At everything," he said. "Family, trust, love." I thought of my father, sitting quietly in the garden outside the hospital, unable to meet my eyes. I thought of my mother, who had loved him still. I think, second chances only matter if someone's willing to change, I said. He nodded, slowly. Then I hoped this was enough to earn one. We drank in silence after that. And later that evening, while I was folding blankets in the guest room, I found something tucked beneath one of the cushions. An envelope, smaller than the one that had brought the threat. Thinner. Inside was a check, written, not to the company, but to my father. Personal, private. With it, a note in Alexander's handwriting. This does not erase the past, but it keeps the future clean. I held the paper in my hands for a long time. It wasn't just about money. It was dignity. It was him saying, "I will carry this burden so you don't have to." That night, I didn't just bring tea to his desk. Stayed. I sat across from him as he worked, and when he looked up, I didn't look away. "You didn't have to do any of this," I said. He smiled gently. "I know." And then, after a long pause, "But I wanted to." It started with a draft. I had opened the window in the linen room for air. Spring was teasing the city again. Soft winds through half-budding trees, the scent of wet concrete and something tender in the air. As I folded fresh sheets, a breeze stirred the corner of an old box tucked behind the cedar chest. It was small, dusty, wrapped in a faded floral scarf I hadn't seen in years. I pulled it out gently, fingers brushing over the cloth, like I might wake a memory. Inside, among yellowed cards and small pins, was a stack of letters tied with navy ribbon. Fragile now, the paper curled at the edges. The top letter bore my mother's handwriting, the address smeared faintly by time. It was postmarked 1987, my breath stilled. I carried the box to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor. I untied the ribbon slowly, not out of ceremony, but because something about the weight of it felt sacred, as if part of me already knew what I was about to read would shift something I thought I understood. The letter opened with a name I didn't know. Dearest John. I read on, heart tight, as my mother's words spilled across the page, words I had never heard from her lips, written in a voice far younger, more vulnerable, and yet deeply sure. You were my first choice, but not my only path. I hope you know that. I chose my family. I chose my duty. And some days that choice feels heavy, but I could not regret it, because it gave me Vi. And she is my greatest joy. The rest of the letter was a goodbye, a gentle severing, a letting go of a man she once loved, but could never be with. I sat with it in my lap for a long time, the room still except for the clock ticking on the mantel. I had always known my mother was strong. I had seen her bear illness, disappointment, and sacrifice with grace that felt almost inhuman. But I had never imagined her as a woman who once loved deeply and gave it up, not for status, not for appearance, but for family. For me. Tears came, slow and quiet, more awe than sadness. When I finally stood, I walked down the hall to her room. She was sleeping, her breathing shallow but steady. I sat beside her and held her hand, letting the quiet fill the space between us. When she stirred, her eyes fluttered open and found mine. You found the letters, she said simply, as if she had always known this moment would come. I nodded. Why didn't you tell me? Her lips curved into a soft, tired smile. Because love. Love isn't always the grandest part of a life. Sometimes it's what you give up quietly that defines who you are. I swallowed hard. Did you love him more than Dad? I love them differently, she said. One gave me a dream. The other gave me a life. That night I couldn't sleep. The letter echoed in my thoughts. Not because of what it revealed about the past, but because of what it demanded of the present. I thought of Alexander, of all the things he hadn't said, but had shown me. The photo of his sister, the withdrawal from the deal. He wasn't perfect, but he was choosing me, one quiet act at a time. Maybe love didn't always arrive with fireworks and grand gestures. Maybe sometimes it looked like staying when you could walk away, like pouring tea in silence, like a man playing a ballad on a piano no one knew he could touch. Later that evening, I found him in the library. The fire was low. He was seated in the leather chair near the window, shirt sleeves rolled, tie gone. A glass of water rested on the table beside him, untouched. I entered quietly, the letter in my hand. He looked up, brows rising slightly in question. I found something today, I said. He waited. I handed him the letter, not for him to read, but just to feel the paper, the years, the weight. It's from my mother, to a man she once loved. His eyes softened, but he said nothing. She gave him up. For my father. For me. I hesitated. And she never told anyone. Until now. Alexander studied my face, then the envelope in his hand. She didn't want to burden you, he said. No, I replied. She wanted me to understand. I sat across from him, knees tucked beneath me like I used to as a girl. I used to think love was something that found you, I continued. That it was instant, sweeping, loud. But maybe it's something you build, quietly, brick by brick. Alexander's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I've never built anything outside of business, he said. Never thought I knew how. You're learning, I said softly. He looked at me then, fully, deeply. And I saw, it not a promise, but an invitation. It began with soup, a simple request from my mother that morning. Nothing fancy, Just broth and bread. And both of you. She said it with a playful firmness that only the frail can pull off, with a smile that knew it would be her last dinner seated at that kitchen table. So I cooked. Slowly. Carefully. I chopped carrots, while the broth simmered, remembering the way she'd hum tuneless melodies over boiling pots when I was little. The kitchen filled with warmth, not just from the stove, but from something older, something shared. Alexander arrived just before sunset. He had changed. No tie, no jacket. Just a soft gray sweater and quiet footsteps. He looked more like a man returning home than a billionaire stepping through marble halls. My mother smiled when he walked in. "Did you wash your hands?" she asked, like she had every right to. He didn't even flinch. Just nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped toward the sink. I watched him from across the counter, stunned by the ease in his movements, the quiet grace that had begun to replace formality. He dried his hands and turned to me. "Can I help?" I blinked, a little startled, then handed him the bread knife. "Just cut. Straight lines, no pressure," he smirked. "I'm not performing surgery. Bread's more delicate than people think." We worked side by side, me at the stove, him slicing carefully. No orchestras, no dramatic lighting. Just two people making dinner like they'd done it 100 times before. And in some strange way, it felt like we had. Dinner was quiet, but not in the way silence had once filled this house. This was different. Easy. Filled with the clink of spoons and the occasional laugh when the salt was too much, or the bread slightly burnt. My mother watched us, her eyes warm but distant, like she was already halfway between this world and something gentler. After we finished, she reached for my hand and then Alexander's. "I just wanted to see it," she said. "What it looks like when people choose each other." We didn't say anything, but I felt his fingers shift slightly beneath hers. Later, after we helped her back to bed and dimmed the lights, I returned to the kitchen. The dishes still sat in the sink, the scent of rosemary broth clinging to the air. I turned on the faucet, but before I could start scrubbing, Alexander appeared behind me. "I've got it," he said, reaching for a towel. We moved together in silence, hands brushing now and then. No apologies, no flinching. And then, without a word, he reached across me to set a plate down, and stayed there. Close. Solid. I felt the warmth of him, the way his breath stirred the hair near my ear. I didn't move. "I used to think love was control," he said softly. "Being the one who never needed. Never asked. Never broke." My hands stilled under the water. "And now?" I asked. He hesitated. "Now I think it's about standing still long enough for someone to reach you." He turned me gently, his hands at my elbows, grounding me. I looked up, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what I'd find in his eyes. Not distance, not duty, just something quiet and real. "I don't want to be someone who protects you from a distance anymore," he said. "I want to be beside you when it hurts. And when it doesn't, I want to stay." He didn't kiss me. He didn't have to. Instead, he reached for my hand, fingers weaving through mine with the kind of care that made me want to cry. It was slow, deliberate, like he knew this was the moment I would remember. Not any ceremony or vow. And I did. I would remember it for the rest of my life. The warmth of his palm, the scent of soap and rosemary, the sound of my mother's breath, drifting faintly down the hall. It wasn't passion that held me still. It was peace. Later, we stood at the window in the hallway, the city lights blinking like tired eyes. I leaned against his shoulder, and he rested his chin lightly on my hair. "Did I ever tell you," I murmured, "that I thought you hated me on our wedding day?" He laughed softly. "I thought you were going to run." "I thought about it. But you stayed. So did you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, because I knew. Knew what? That if I let you walk out of my life, I'd never find another way back to myself. I turned toward him, my heart full in my chest. "You're not who I expected," I whispered. "Neither are you," he said. "You're better." And then, as the city exhaled and the night settled in around us, I held his hand tighter and said the only thing I knew for sure. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She passed just before dawn. The nurse said it was peaceful. No gasping, no fight. Just a soft exhale, like a candle gently letting go of its flame. I arrived minutes later, still in my robe, my heart strangely calm. As if some part of me already knew. Alexander stood beside me at her bedside. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. I reached for her hand. It was cool, but not yet cold. I pressed it to my cheek and closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "For everything. For staying. For choosing. For teaching me how to do the same." There was a letter waiting for me on her nightstand. A small envelope, sealed with wax the color of cream roses. My name in her handwriting, the letters thin and slightly trembling. Waited until we were home. Home, not just the townhouse, to open it. I sat at the vanity where I'd once found her first letter, the morning after my wedding, and unfolded this last one slowly. "My dearest Vi, if you're reading this, then I'm already where the pain is quiet and the tea always stays warm. I've watched you these past weeks. You've grown in silence, in grief, in love. And though I may not see your tomorrow, I have seen your courage. That is enough for any mother's heart. I once gave up love for duty. It was not a mistake, but it was not the only way. You are allowed more. You are allowed both. Don't be afraid to reach for joy, even if it starts quietly. Especially then, choose him, Vi. Not because of what he's done, but because of how you feel when he's near." "Always, Mom," I cried, but not like before. These tears came gently, grateful, steady, without urgency. Like her final gift wasn't the letter, but the permission it carried. Permission to move forward. To belong. To let love become something real, not just survivable. I found Alexander in the kitchen. He was at the stove, awkwardly trying to coax a kettle into whistling. The bread was already sliced. 2 cups waited on the counter. When he turned and saw me, he paused, then stepped closer. "I wanted to bring you tea," he said. "But I wasn't sure how much honey you liked." I smiled. Watery, but true. "More than you think. Less than I admit." He nodded once, then pulled me into his arms. We stood there in the middle of the kitchen. No music, no ceremony. Just the smell of tea and the hum of the city beginning to wake. His hand pressed gently to my back. Mine curled into the fabric of his shirt. "Will you stay here?" I whispered into his chest. He pulled back just enough to look at me. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, then softer. "You gave me a home I didn't know I was missing." That morning we drank our tea at the small table near the window. The light was soft gold, painting the countertop and the lines of his face in something almost sacred. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Somewhere in the silence, he reached for my hand, held it. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was performing someone else's script. I was simply living. Later that day, I opened the drawer of the vanity one last time. I placed both letters, her first and her last, together in a box lined with velvet. I added a fresh note of my own. "Dear Mom, I stayed, and he did too. We've started making tea together. Sometimes he plays piano, just enough to make the mornings feel like stories. I think you were right. Love may not come first, but it came last, and it stayed." I sealed the box, set it gently at the back, of the drawer. Then I stepped out into the hall, into the warmth of morning. Alexander was waiting, coffee in one hand, my sewing basket in the other. "You forgot this," he said with a small smile. "On purpose," I replied, taking it. "It's your turn to thread the needle." "Terrifying," he said. "But worth it," I added, nudging him with my shoulder. He didn't argue. We spent the rest of the day folding blankets, straightening bookshelves, and planning to repaint the guest room. Nothing extraordinary, nothing grand, but everything real. That night, as we lay in bed, the window cracked just enough to let the city breathe through our silence. He reached for me under the sheets. Not in hunger, but in presence. His hand found mine, our fingers tangled, and he whispered the only vow I'd ever needed. "I choose you. Every morning, every cup, every silence. You're mine." I turned toward him, kissed the space beneath his jaw, and answered in the only way that mattered. "I choose you too." If this story spoke to your heart, please give it a like to let me know you're out there listening. And if you'd like to join me for more quiet moments, tender choices, and the kind of love that grows in silence, consider subscribing. Sometimes all it takes is a story to bring a little warmth to the day.